Continuing Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. And we are continuing the comparison of Numa with Lycurgus. And, okay, where's the start of the sentence? It was at his business at the outset, whilst there was no great disparity in the states of men, and whilst people still lived much in one manner, to obviate as Lycurgus did, and take measures of precaution against the mischiefs of avarice, mischiefs not of small importance, but the real seed and first beginning of all great and extensive evils of after times. The redivision of the states, Lycurgus is not, it seems to me, to be blamed for making, nor Numa for omitting. This quality was the basis and foundation of one commonwealth, but at Rome, where the lands had been lately divided, there was nothing to urge any redivision or disturbance of the first arrangement, which was probably still in existence. With respect to wives and children, and that community which both, with a sound policy, appointed to prevent all jealousy, their methods, however, were different. For when a Roman thought himself to have a sufficient number of children, in case his neighbor, who had none, should come and request his wife of him, he had a lawful power to give her up to him who desired her, either for a certain time or for good. The Lacedaemonian husband, on the other hand, might allow the use of his wife to any other that desired to have children by her, and yet still keep her in his house. The original marriage obligation still subsisted as at first. Nay, many husbands, as we have said, would invite men whom they thought likely to procure them fine and good-looking children into their houses. What is the difference, then, between the two customs? Shall we say that the Lacedaemonian system is one of an extreme and entire unconcern about their wives, and would cause most people endless disquiet and annoyance with pangs and jealousies? Well, maybe it did with them too, but they're, a lot of repression of how you're supposed to feel goes on to this day. The Roman course, whereas an air of a more delicate acquiescence draws the veil of a new contract over the change, and concedes the general insupportableness of mere community. Numa's directions, too, for the care of young women are better adapted to the female sex and to propriety. Lycurgus's are altogether unreserved and unfeminine, and have given a great handle to the poets, who call them, Lycurgus, for example, phoenumerites, bare-thighed, and give them the character, as does Euripides, of being wild after husbands. These, with the young men, from the house go out, with thighs that show, and robes that fly about. For, in fact, the skirts of the frock worn by unmarried girls were not sewn together at the lower part, but used to fly back and show the whole thigh, bare as they walked. The thing is most distinctly given by Sophocles. She also, the young maid, whose frock no robe, it o'er it laid, folding back, leaves her bare thigh free. Hermione. And so their women, it is said, were bold and masculine, overbearing to their husbands in the first place. I wonder why they wanted to go out to war all the time, right? Absolute mistresses in their houses, giving their opinions about public matters freely, and speaking openly even on the most important subjects. Now in the Bible, that bit about not talking in church, well, the Christian opinion is women don't speak in public at all. They can talk amongst family gatherings, but ecclesia is not just church, it's any gathering that has political import like but anyway. But the matron, not that I'm agreeing with either side here, but the matrons under the government of Numa still indeed received from their husbands all that high respect and honor which had been paid them under Romulus as a sort of atonement for the violence done to them. Nevertheless, great modesty was enjoined upon them. All busy, intermeddling forbidden, sobriety insisted on, and silence made habitual. Wine they were not to touch at all, nor to speak, except in their husbands' company, even on the most ordinary subjects, so that once, when a woman had the confidence to plead her own cause in a court of judicature, the Senate, it is said, sent to inquire of the oracle what the prodigy did portend. And, indeed, their general good behavior and submissiveness is justly proved by the record of those that were otherwise, as for the Greek historians record in their annals the names of those who first unsheathed the sword of civil war, or murdered their brothers, or were parricides, or killed their mothers. So the Roman writers report it as the first example that Spurius Carvilius divorced his wife, being a case that never before happened in the space of 230 years from the foundation of that city, and that one Thalaa, the wife of Pinarius, had a quarrel, the first instance of that kind, with her brother-in-law, Gagania. Well, they won't have a mythical origin of such events, but certainly would have happened for millions of years, right? And it appears it happens among other primates too. In the reign of Tarquinius, Cerbus, so successful, was the legislator in securing order and good conduct in the marriage relation. Their respective regulations for marrying the young women are in accordance with those for their education. Lycurgus made them brides when they were full of age and inclination for it. Intercourse, where nature was thus consulted, would produce, he thought, love and tenderness, instead of the dislike and fear attending an unnatural compulsion, and their bodies also would be better able to bear the trials of breeding and of bearing children. In his judgment, the one end of marriage. Some refuse to get married without that. I myself have decided not to marry a certain individual because having children would not have been part of it. Not because of their age, it was a medical issue. But yeah, that was a deal breaker for me because I wanted at least a chance at it. It's not guaranteed with anybody, but you know. Well, there were other reasons, but the Romans, on the other hand, gave their daughters in marriage as early as 12 years old, or even under. Thus, they thought, their bodies alike and minds would be delivered to the future husbands pure and undefiled. Well, with early puberty disorder, that's, may not be quite the case. And in America, there's other issues more serious than that. The way of Lycurgus seems the more, but notice that most of these cultures, they don't, consummating the marriage with the pre-adolescent is not acceptable. So when you read of most of the cultures that do this, this is not acceptable. But the Greeks, that's sort of a different thing, we would presume, based on some of the other stuff we've been going over in this alone. The way of Lycurgus seems the more natural with a view to the birth of children. The other, looking to a life to be spent together, is more moral. Well, you can merge the two, right? However, the rules which Lycurgus drew up for superintendence of children, their collection into companies, their discipline and association, as also his exact regulations for their meals, exercises, and sports, argue Numa no more than an ordinary lawgiver. Numa left the whole matter the whole matter simply to be decided by the parents' wishes or necessities. He might, if he pleased, make his son a husbandman or carpenter, coppersmith or musician, as if it were of no importance for them to be directed and trained up from the beginning to one and the same common end, or as though it would do for them to be like passengers on a shipboard, brought thither, each for his own ends and by his own choice, uniting to act for the common good only in the time of danger, upon occasion of their private fears, in general looking simply to their own interests. We may forbear indeed to blame common legislators, who may be deficient in power and knowledge, but when a wise man like Numa had received the sovereignty over a new and docile people, was there anything that would better deserve his attention than the education of children and the training up of the young, not to the contrariety and discordance of character, but to the unity of the common model of virtue to which, from their cradle, they should have been formed and molded? One benefit, among many that Lycurgus obtained by his course, was the permanence which it secured to his laws. The obligation of oaths to preserve them would have availed but little, if he had not, by discipline and education, infused them into the children's characters, and imbued their whole early life with the love of the government. The result was that the main points and fundamentals of his legislation continued for about 500 years, like some deep and thoroughly ingrained tincture, retaining their hold upon the nation. But Numa's whole design and aim was continuance of peace and goodwill. On his death vanished with him. No sooner did he expire in his last breath than the gates of Janus's temple flew wide open, and, as it were, war had indeed been kept and caged up within those walls. It rushed forth to fill all Italy with blood and slaughter. And thus that best and justed fabric of things was no longer continuance, but it wanted that cement which should have kept all together, education. What then, some may say, has not Rome been advanced and bettered by her wars? A question that will need a long answer, if it is to be one to satisfy men who take the better to consist in riches, luxury, and dominion, rather than in security, gentleness, and that independence which is accompanied by justice. However, it makes much for Lycurgus that after the Romans had deserted the doctrine and discipline of Numa, their empire grew, and their power increased so much, whereas so soon as the Lacedaemonians fell from the institutions of Lycurgus, they sank from the highest to the lowest state, and after forfeiting their supremacy over the rest of Greece, were themselves in danger of absolute extirpation. Thus much, meantime, was peculiarly signal and almost divine in the circumstances of Numa, that he was an alien, and yet courted to come and accept a kingdom, and frame of which, though he entirely altered, yet he performed it by mere persuasion, and ruled a city that as yet had scarce become one city, without recurring to arms or any violence such as Lycurgus used, supporting himself by the aid of the nobler citizens against the commonalty, but by mere force of wisdom and justice, establish union and harmony amongst all. Now, ordinary, maybe not ordinary, but maybe not divine authority that we should, look and say, well, at least for that time, this was, maybe you didn't have a choice politically, but, religious authority, not really. But we also see in Numa an example of how nationality doesn't quite matter so much. What matters is, do they have the ethos to be good for their country?